Hello, YouTube. This is Gavaguy. I've been in a conversation with a G plus person named Rich White. Uh, he, well, let me, I guess, start from the top. Rich responded to a post that in a thread, comment thread. Initially, it was about something about hate speech and um, it was posted by everyone's favorite fundamentalist, Jungle Jargon. Um, and Jungle Jargon was the essence of the meme that Jungle Jargon shared was that it's somehow uh, punishable to or hate speech to speak the truth. Well, obviously there are problems with that, and and I expressed, how I thought that that was baloney. And Jungle Jargon went on about how people are being imprisoned and tortured today for speaking the truth and whatever. Um, so anyhow, um, Rich White joined in the conversation pretty early on. It looks like it's only right now. It's only 44 comments long, um, but he's we've kind of gotten down to just the kind of the great debate at its core, and why I don't believe personally, um, and let's see. I mean, so one of the things one of the things that Rich said. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my cat out of here. Come on, don't eat wires. Um, so one of the things that Rich initially said was, uh, let's see, let me back up with just a hair here. Um, Jesus performed miracles. This is apparently why he believes in things. And the resurrection are the most attested events in ancient history. Um, and the only way I can claim that there's no evidence for God is if I reject and ignore all the evidence for God. So all of this stuff in history, he's saying, um, is evidence, or and I would I would not use the term history for those things, um, because I don't believe that they're history. Obviously, if I believed that those things were history, and legitimately happened, well, yeah, that would be compelling, and I would say, okay, sure, this must have taken place. Um, so, and I tried to invite him early on. He didn't want to have a hangout. So I told him, this is. I said, um, and I had mentioned Santa Claus earlier, and he said, "Well, there are more people who believe that God exists than people who believe in Santa Claus." Um, I don't know. And he said that the existence of God is self-evident. Um, and I basically I made the argument. I said, "Well, look, what you're appealing to is essentially popular opinion, um, and that's." I mean, it's fallacious. I didn't say it in those words, but I mean, people have believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and all the planets, stars, and sun and moon were in orbit around it. People believed in witches and ghosts and goblins and all kinds of other mythical creatures and things, historically, and that was the majority view. To to doubt that meant that you were doubting the majority opinion of the general population. Well, uh, Rich shot back and said, "Well, it's funny I should say that because most atheists defend evolution by the majority, However, he wasn't making an argument from majority. Well, he kind of was. He said, "Did you know that more people believe in Santa Claus than believe that God doesn't exist?" So he's essentially saying the majority of people believe in a God, not his God, but a God, and the majority of people believe that, and people don't believe in Santa Claus. Well, that's a ad populum fallacy. He's saying I should believe it because so many people do, and he's saying, well, the reason that they do is because it's self-evident. Well, the reason that people believed that the earth wasn't moving was because intuitively it is self-evident that the earth is not moving. We experience sensations when we are on a moving surface or moving something, and we don't experience that when we are just standing still on the surface of the earth. So it is, by measure, things that we kind of take intuitively, we could say it's self-evident that the earth is not moving, um, and and this is why that belief kind of held a grip on uh, the majority of mankind throughout the majority of history, is because that was supposedly self-evident. So that's an ad populum, and it's a kind of an appeal to intuition. It's not a legitimate form of argumentation. Um, let's see. Atheism is hard to believe that more people believe in Santa Claus. Blah blah blah. So where did he go here? It's interesting that I didn't touch the fact that Jesus and his miracles and resurrections are the most attested events in history. Denying those events is the historical equivalent of denying air. Well, not really. And I'll explain why in a minute. Not only is the existence of God self-evident, but his identity is the most attested historical fact of human existence. Wow, these are really huge claims, and clearly it's not the case. Because there's only a handful of writers who have attested to that. A handful of people who claim and stick to their claim that this God is the God, and there's only and there are many attestations that other gods are the God, or other gods are among one of many gods or something. I mean, there's all kinds of claims of this kind, just like there are all kinds of claims about ghosts and witches and other things throughout history. And we don't accept those claims now because they're not credible. And so, and we we can understand that they're not credible because we have a different perspective on things. So I asked him if smoking causes cancer, in his opinion or his understanding. He didn't want to bite on that because it wasn't readily apparent where I was going with that. So I went into a long explanation as to why I brought this up, and um, why I believe that evolution is true. It's not because it's the majority a popular opinion. It's because it's the popular opinion of experts. We can look at kind of the history of science with regard to smoking tobacco, and we can see that there was building consensus in the general scientific community that smoking has strong causal link to development of cancer in human beings. And there was a small contingency of people who had scientific credentials who issued a different opinion. Now, just about all of those people that produced quote unquote research on the subject of smoking tobacco and cancer and other emphysema and other kinds of diseases and things. But just about all of that research that said, well, no, there's no real causal link. the funding from those individuals who produced those studies were from the tobacco industry. The funding came from the tobacco industry, and the conclusion was kind of the conclusions of the studies uh, was they wouldn't get their funding if they didn't conclude the right thing. Um, Whereas all of the rest of these scientists whose funding came from independent sources and things, whose payment and receipt of funds was not dependent on the outcome of their research. Those scientists were in agreement, and they were diverse. They were from universities. They were from medical science labs and other places like that. And so that's the reason that we eventually came to kind of the general understanding in society that smoking causes cancer, or can cause cancer, and it greatly increases our likelihood of developing cancer and other diseases. Um, there was a period of time when there was some confusion in the public because um, even though there were studies that were conducted, and I use scare quotes with that, those studies were not peer reviewed. They were rejected by peer reviewed publications because their methodology and things was specious, um, and um, they had results that were kind of uh, questionable and things. Meanwhile, these other studies that were peer reviewed, they were examined by other scientists and said okay, they followed good protocol, they had good methodology, and the analysis of the data and things was done um, objectively, and all of the proper procedures and things were done to arrive at these conclusions that pardon, that there is a link between smoking and causing cancer. This is how science works, and it's the experts in the field are critically examine each other's work, um, and that's kind of where you get the best answers. And when there's consensus, that's where you can have good, strong, um, kind of what's the word? You can kind of rely on those things, those conclusions, and that scientific understanding. Does that mean it's 100% right? No, but you're much better. It's a much safer bet to go with the consensus opinion. You can say provisionally, this is where the consensus sits, and you can say when things change, when there comes a point when there's debate and questions among the experts, then you can say, okay, well, we don't know. There's new information, or there's become reason to doubt and be skeptical, and we can revert to a state of just not knowing, and saying, well, we're waiting for further evidence, for further investigation, and that's a fair thing to do. Uh, there were other periods in our history when similar circumstances happened like this. There was industry that was promoting the inclusion of lead in our fuels and in our paints and all kinds of things that were available for public consumption, and and the strong industry proponents of using lead in products uh, hired scientists. And again, I'm using quotes there. They were definitely experts in the field, but they were there to kind of cloud the story. And people went before Congress, and you had, a group of scientists and things who had independent funding, who came to the conclusion that this is having serious effects that are negative in our public health, and we should really do everything that we can to limit the use of lead in our consumer products and things. Um, So there was a good deal of confusion in the public for a while. They were saying, "Well, lead occurs naturally. It's a just a natural substance." Well, it's not floating around in the air all the time like it was when we uh, had it in our fuels. There was, residue, lead residue all over the place, and children, putting their hands in their mouths and things. It was having serious effects, measurable um, effects, negative effects on the health of children and adults alike. But anyhow, the point is, good science kind of bears out this way, and when you have a group of scientists who have an agenda because of maybe funding, or they have a bias, in the case of creation science, that bias is based on their theology and their doctrines, and they will not produce anything that will contradict their theology on principle. Um, and it is limited to a very small contingency of people with some scientific backgrounds, but they're very small, and they all have the same fundamentalist commitments to a literal interpretation of the Bible. Um, when you see that happening, and then you see the broad community of scientists at large, from diverse backgrounds. There are Christians and Muslims and Hindus and non-believers, um, people of from around the world, different cultures, um, and different interests and funding sources and things. The whole rest of the scientific community, all in agreement on uh, the reality of evolution, um, and the soundness of the theory. You've got a pretty good case, and it makes, your safest bet is to go with that scientific consensus from the broad community. Now you can choose and say, I'm going to stick with this group here, this small contingency. Um, but I think by doing that, you are just kind of going with confirmation bias, and ignoring the evidence that you dislike, as opposed to the other. So, and he got offended here and said, "Well, are you calling me a liar?" I don't think that you're a liar, Rich. And I explained this. I we are in disagreement, and I mean, if I'm calling you a liar, then you're also calling me a liar. So I mean, we could both sit here and be offended, or we can have the discussion and try to hash it out and figure out, well, where can we go to try and settle the debate between us about these issues. Um, I mean, if you're going to say, on the one hand, um, I believe that tobacco causes cancer because that's the consensus opinion in the scientific community, um, then it doesn't seem like you're being consistent when you say that creationism is the true thing, when the consensus opinion in the scientific community is that it is not, and that there's no good evidence for creationism. There's no scientific theory of creationism. It's just a group of people who are basically saying, no, look at all the problems with evolution, and um, and that's pretty much all that creationism, and the scientists who espouse creationism are about, is trying to poke holes in the theory of evolution, which is not. I mean, poking holes in theories is part of science, but to try and pretend like, um, if I poke holes in Newton's laws, that doesn't mean that my religion is right. You know, all I've done is made holes in someone else's theory. My theory doesn't win by default. There are other competing theories and ideas that are out there, and so you have to present positive evidence that your ideas are actually true. Um, so I laid out a few things that I would accept as positive evidence that Christianity is true. And I said, well, if you know we had evidence that Christian followers, um, you know, where Christian followers went, could witness miracles, and we could have them actually documented, and studied. We don't see that. That's not the case. And and there are kind of rumors of miracles here and there, uh, that have happened in history, but uh, it also is true that as we developed cameras and uh, you know, more sophisticated means of recording and capturing data and information and documentation and those kinds of things, uh, we see the claims of miracles kind of plummet. Um, and you know, now what we're limited to is people seeing funny lights when they take a photo with their camera, um, you know, because of light glinting off of dust particles or fluctuation in lenses and things. Um, so you know, we really don't get any decent miracles. People aren't being healed. Blind people aren't seeing without the help of medical attention. People aren't raised from the dead unless they've got CPR, and then in that case, they're not really raised from the dead either. I had a Christian friend of mine who, you know, I was asking him if he'd ever seen miracles, and he basically said, "Well, I'll get back to you," and came to me excitedly on Facebook and said, "Well, I've got a miracle. I've got a miracle. A guy at church was raised from the dead." And it turns out, well, they administered CPR and he was revived. Well, that's not death. You know, go to a morgue where someone has had medical certification and death certificate issued to them, and let's see someone pray for those people or one of those people and see them be raised from the dead. And yeah, then if we can document that and actually show that that's real and true, that would be some compelling evidence, you know, for Christianity, if it was actually a Christian that did that. There are other things too that we see, but you know, because we don't see miracles today, it makes me very suspect of claims of miracles in the past. And there are miracles supposedly into the Middle Ages, all kinds of things. But there are also people who believe that witches were transforming into cats, and there were people that were burned alive because of this, and just horrific things, and they were based on bad beliefs. Um, you know, bad beliefs prospered in societies that were not skeptical, and this is still true today. There are people being burned alive and stoned to death in Africa for being witches, in certain parts of Africa. Um, there there are people who in Papua New Guinea, I believe, where they try and do incantations and spells and things, and they think that this is all legitimate, that it all works. Well, you know, we can test these things, and anytime that we test any of this stuff, it falls apart and doesn't hold any water. Um, so uh, Rich continues on. All four Gospels were written before 70 A.D. and the epistles were written before the Gospels. There's some debate about the times of the Gospels were written, and what we essentially have with the Gospels uh, is we have the Gospel of Mark, which is pretty much uh, there's pretty broad consensus that Mark was the earliest gospel. It's the shortest, and Jesus does the fewest miracles. He does the fewest. He's the most human in the Gospel of Mark. Well, surprise, surprise, that's the oldest one. Um, he becomes more supernatural. We add birth narrative, and there are added passages to beyond his death. And really, in the oldest versions of the Gospel of Mark, the oldest copies, there's not even a resurrection story. That was added in centuries afterward. So you have the writers of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel that we call Matthew. These anonymous writers have tacked on other information. They've made Jesus. He kind of grows in his superpowers, and until the latest gospel, which is the Gospel of John, um, Jesus is equal with God. Well, that's not true in any of the earlier Gospels. He's not equal with God. He's not. He refers to himself as the Son of Man, not the Son of God. He doesn't, he doesn't make these bold claims about his divinity or anything as he does in the Gospel of John. Well, if that's the latest gospel that's written, but he actually said those things, why wouldn't the earlier gospel writers have written about that? Um, Another thing is, uh, none of these gospels were written in the first person. Nobody says, "Well, this is what I saw." Da 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 da. And by the way, my name is so and so. We have kind of these legends or church tradition that it was written by such and such, but all of this was contested. There were arguments in the early church in the second century and things as to who wrote these books. There were debates. There were other books that were, claimed to be written by the same authors that were other, different versions of the Gospels, from what I gather. And the whole history of kind of compiling the New Testament was a messy one. Um, so there's good reason to be skeptical and doubtful that any of this happened. When we have the earliest account is the most natural account, the one that Jesus is the most human. He's a teacher. He travels around. People are engaged by him, and he's eventually kind of put to death. There's also good historical reasons for believing that Jesus was never buried in a tomb. Um, and the people that are included in the gospel narratives, there's no other record or accounts of these other people, Joseph of Arimathea and things, that appears, I believe, only in the Gospel of Matthew. Um, their names are kind of very conveniently, meaningful. And this is what I've understood from actual Bible scholars, and I went to a Christian college where I took Bible classes. There are discrepancies between the stories. The Gospel of Matthew has a genealogy of Jesus, and the Gospel of Luke has a genealogy of Jesus, and they're quite different. If you now they go in kind of opposite directions. One goes from Jesus backwards, and then the other one goes, from, I don't know if it's Adam or David, but he goes forward to Jesus. But if you look, in the sequence. The names that they give are very different. They start with Jesus's father, who is Joseph, even though Jesus doesn't actually have any of Joseph's blood, if the Bible is true. So this genealogy leading back through Joseph doesn't really make any sense. And then even Jesus's grandfather, just back, 2 generations, they couldn't agree and couldn't figure out who his grandfather was, and there's disagreement. And so there's two different names that are not the same, and they, this is conflict. So it's kind of sloppy work, and there's reason to be doubtful and skeptical that it's accurate. They're written anonymously, and as I said, kind of one of the telltale signs of a fish story that has grown and grown is that the earliest account is the most kind of humble and restricted, and then as you progress in time, as the story gets retold, it becomes more and more miraculous and kind of outlandish. And that's exactly what we see. We also see in the Gospel of John that Jesus resurrects his good friend Lazarus, who's not mentioned in the other Gospels. There's a story of Lazarus, I want to say in Luke, and that Lazarus dies and goes to hell. And when, or no, I'm sorry, the Lazarus was the poor man, and he went to heaven, and there was another rich man in hell who wanted to send or go back and visit his relatives to tell them to obey God and things. So it's almost like the writer, the author of the Gospel of John, looked back and said, well, heck, Jesus could raise him from the dead, so Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead in my story. That's because he's super Jesus. And all of these things really lead to questioning whether or not this is real and true. Another thing about it is that there's not contiguity throughout the Bible. The Old Testament God is a much different God than the New Testament God. There's no mention of hell in the Old Testament. Why did he forget to mention hell? If it's said in the Old Testament, if you fail to sacrifice your sheep and animals and kill this stuff for me so that I can forgive you, then you'll go to hell. Also, make sure to cut off the end of your penis. When you get to the New Testament, cutting off the end of your penis is no big deal. Sacrificing animals for forgiveness is gone because Jesus, who is also God, killed himself to pay the debt for our sins to himself so that he could forgive us and stop himself from torturing us in hell, which he forgot to mention in the Old Testament. All of these things are just out of whack, out of step. The killing, the mass genocide and killing and horrific laws from the Old Testament, gone. We don't have to do those things anymore. Well, was it good when it was in the Old Testament? Why isn't it good now? Why don't we stone our children to death when they're disobedient or disrespectful? If you want to claim that that we should uphold the law, that's part of the law. We've done away with slavery. Was it better to have slavery in society? I don't think so. Why was it included in the Old Testament as okay? And why was it affirmed in the New Testament? Slaves, obey your masters. And Paul sends a slave, Onesimus, back to Philemon in the epistle to Philemon. There are also, consent among scholars is that there are a number of forgeries that were written in Paul's name in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, that were included in the canon. Um, I don't know off the top of my head, but this is the consensus view, and even biblical scholars, even fundamentalist Christian biblical scholars, will concede, okay, yeah, this the language is so different that, I mean, there are a few that are not contested, that are believed to be, people are quite confident that Paul wrote them, but there are others, they're called pseudepigrapha, and they were forgeries. So, were those inspired? Were those the inspired word of God? Well, why? What determines that? If their authorship was a lie, um, how is that? All these things, lead me to question. So, we had kind of back and forth quite a bit, Rich and I, about whether or not to do this in a hangout, and there was just so much that he had said that I disagreed with. Typing this all out would have taken quite a bit longer for me than just kind of talking about it. Rich, I really wish that you had been able to join me. I understand hangouts are not for everyone. The final thing that he's said here is the only thing that I really need to answer is, why do I reject the quote unquote most attested historical event in ancient history? It's not. The historicity of the Gospels and the historicity of the New Testament is contested, and if you look beyond just the same kind of small community of scholars that are committed to the infallibility and inerrancy of Scripture, the fundamentalist scholars, and even some of those, like I said, I went to a Christian college. It wasn't a Bible college; it was a liberal arts college with degrees and things from anything from teaching and mathematics and sciences and whatever. But it was kind of a major denomination, fundamentalist denomination. It was the Assemblies of God, and the professors there acknowledged problems and conflicts in the Gospels. They acknowledged that there were books that were believed to be forgeries. They believed that all of these things, the historicity even of like this, which Herod, at Jesus' birth narrative, is it the Gospel of Matthew or Luke? I forget which one. But the idea that they fled to Egypt and to hide from Herod while all of these babies were being slaughtered. This is not. There's no account of this anywhere but in that gospel, and that's the only gospel where that's mentioned. There's no other historical evidence that anything like that occurred, period. And that's a pretty major event. If some king went around and slaughtered all of the children, all of the infants, that would be news, and it would have been documented, because there were horrific things that went on that were carried out by the government and by the Romans, that were documented, but we don't have any records of anything like that. Also, there are discrepancies and problems with the timeline based on a census that was supposedly going on, and King Herod's rule, because there's a mismatch there. There's also problems historically as far as a census compelling people to go to their hometowns, because that doesn't make any sense, and there's no record of that ever happening, where you would have this mass migration of people going back to their homeland or something. Um, from the perspective of a census that's inefficient, it would cause huge disruptions in society, and it's not sensible, and there's no historical evidence that something like that occurred. It's a narrative device in the plot, a plot device to try and move Jesus where he was supposed to be for his birth, according to one of the author's interpretations of the Old Testament, and so that's how you get it. Um, there are conflicts with the death and resurrection and things. Which day Jesus was crucified, when he died, what he said when he died, um, what he said when he was brought before Pilate. Um, there are differences between the responses and reactions of Pilate. Uh, so there's consensus among most scholars that Jesus was an actual historical person, but there's some growing question about that among some scholars. That's not the consensus view. But and then the consensus view is that he probably did agitate, um, you know, people enough that he was crucified, and but that's about it. From there, people that were crucified are primarily thought to have just been left to hang on the cross to be picked apart by carrion birds and not buried. Um, they they didn't want to give criminals an honorable burial. Um, so there's conflicts about who went to the tomb. There's all of these things lead us to question whether or not and whatever happened. Um, and to say that maybe I've heard some Christians say, and this is not something that Rich has said. Well, was it hundreds of people saw Jesus in the ascension? Well, we don't know that. We know that one person wrote that down, that hundreds of people did it. I mean, I could write that 1,000 people saw me flap my arms and fly around town, but that doesn't mean that it's true that 100 people or 600 people or 1,000 people did that. It just means that one person wrote it and then passed it on to someone else to read. That's all that means. So, because of these problems with the text, because of problems with the historicity of the text, because I don't see any reason to believe that miracles happened back then when we don't see them happening now. We do have good reason to believe that people believed that miraculous, magical things were happening in history when they really weren't happening, and there were other rational and logical explanations for it. Um, these are the reasons that I don't believe, and uh, I'm more than happy to listen if you have examples of miracles that you've seen. Most of the miracles that I've ever seen, having grown up in the church and things, consisted of someone's headache going away, or a sore back that felt better, or their cough felt better, or things along those lines, things that happen naturally and normally, in times when people actually had terminal illnesses. um, you know uh, I never saw miracles. I was a firm devout believer. I believed with my whole being that the God of the Bible was a real God. I believed that He was a merciful and loving God, and I told my friends about it. I tried to tell my coworkers, and I was full in. And But when I looked back, I realized, man, nothing that I expected to have happened in my life, to evidence that there's actually something real going on here, that I'm having conversations with a divine being. Um, there was no evidence of that ever happening at all. Period. Um, there was evidence that I was talking to myself. There was evidence that um, I was spending a lot of time and energy um, devoted to something that really was not very credible. So that's my response, and that's my reply. Um, like I said, I kind of wish that you had been able to join me, Rich. Um, I'm sure you've got a lot to say in response, and if you want to write a response in that same thread, I'll be more than happy to read it and take a look at what you have to say. But that's all I've got for tonight. Thanks for watching, and everybody have a good night.